Good morning, church. I want to direct your attention to your bulletin because it talks about in 2 weeks from today we will be having a sunrise service. It's going to be at 6:45 this year. We're a little bit later into the season, and so it's going to be a little bit earlier. But those who have come have really enjoyed this time together. We meet back here, weather permitting, on the softball field. And we'll sing some songs about the resurrection and the empty tomb. And then we gather for breakfast, and that may be my favorite part, is just the time we have the fellowship with each other. This is not the same sermon that will be, or in fact, I don't even know that I'm going to be doing anything at the sunrise service. I think we may just sing this year. But it's not the same as what we will be doing at the 10 o'clock hour, okay? It's in addition to. But come join us for that. I think that if you talk to anyone who has, they'll tell you that it's really a good experience. Also, August 25th is going to be the fundraiser for EEM in Fort Worth at the Fort Worth, what did I say? Oh, not August 25th. That would be April 25th. I got the A part right. But it's really a great event. You learn a lot about what EEM has been doing, and so I want to encourage you to come be a part of that too. Well, we also have some new members I get to announce this morning. John and Michelle and Mason Wright, and if you're here this morning, I'm going to ask you to please stand if you don't mind. I think they're supposed to be here. Right back here. Glad to have you all as a part of our church family. And I want to encourage you to get involved in a life group. It's a good way to get to know a core group of people, and that's really what church is all about. So I want to encourage you in that. How many of you have heard of Billy Joel? Most people in here would have. Billy Joel was a popular singer back in the 70s and 80s, and everyone's blaming themselves for this man's torment. But I said to myself, forget it. I had no hand in that evil. I have no original sin. There's no blood of any sacred martyr on my hands. I pass on all of this. But you know what? I think he probably expresses the sentiment of a lot of people's talk. In history, we still talk about Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. These guys are considered to be some of the greatest philosophers ever. And the reason I say that is because Paul was living roughly in those times. He was living in these times where Greek philosophy was ruling the day. And he says some things that are as relevant today as they were when he spoke them into that culture. When in 1 Corinthians he says this, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate." Where's the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of that which was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power. Now you can read them that way. But you can read them as if it's just a tragic story about a man who laid down his life for a cause. As we 2 weeks ago, we were in Mark chapter 14, where at that time Jesus was on trial. But there he's on trial in a Jewish court. He's on trial before the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jewish people. And what was the issue in that court was Jesus' claim to be Messiah. And once those Jewish officials decided that Jesus was not, in their mind, was not Messiah, they began making fun of him and mocking him. They spit on him, they blindfolded him and hit him with their fists and said, "Prophesy, you Messiah." Today we come to another trial. This is a Roman trial. Different rules, different laws. This is a trial that's going to be before Pilate. And the issue in this trial is not, is Jesus Messiah? The issue in this trial is, does Jesus claim to be a king? Because in the Roman Empire, where Caesar is king, you don't claim to be king. And so that's the issue in this trial. And there's something deeper and more mysterious going on here than just that. So as we read today's text, I want us to think about 4 questions. I want these to kind of be the anchors around which we do this study. 4 questions. The first question is, why was Pilate amazed at the silence of Jesus? Now, we don't know exactly how Jesus spent the hours between his Jewish trial, which was held at night, illegally, by the way, and the Roman trial that takes place the next morning. We could easily surmise it was 4 to 6 hours. So what was he doing? Well, tradition tells us that he was probably placed in a dungeon in Caiaphas' palace. Caiaphas was the high priest, and there has been identified a place that we've been able to visit when we go to Israel, Caiaphas' palace. And it has this hole from the floor down into just a cell, cut out of the rock. And they would lower the prisoners by rope into this place, or sometimes they'd just drop them in. It's about a 10-foot drop probably, maybe a little bit more than that. By the way, last time we were there, it was really cool. There was something that happened that led to this, but Beverly and me and Katie got to spend really precious moment there with our guide. It was just the 4 of us in this place together. As we thought about Jesus being there, and early tradition says that this is probably where he spent this time. The next picture shows what it would look like looking down into it. Now, that podium wasn't there. That's been added, okay? But it's just a room cut out of rock. And perhaps that's where he spent this 6 hours. And so Mark 15 and verse 1 says, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. And so early in the next morning, Jesus is brought out before the Sanhedrin again. You see, the meeting they had during the night, that violated their own law. It violated Jewish law. And so in order to justify their actions, they had to meet in the daytime. Now they know that the charge that they are bringing against Jesus isn't going to stand up in Roman court. And so they have to come up with something else. And Luke tells us in his account that they come up with 3 charges against Jesus. The first is that he was inciting a riot. The second thing that they claimed is that Jesus said, you don't have to pay taxes to Caesar. And the third claim they made is that Jesus claimed to be Messiah, a king. And they made sure that when they present this before the Roman court, that it's very clear that they think Jesus is being inciting an insurrection by this. So with that, they bring Jesus to Pilate. Now, who was Pilate? This is another one of those things where secular scholars and skeptics have ended up with egg on their face, because for years they said, we don't have any proof that there ever was a Pilate. Well, at Caesarea Maritima, that I'm going to mention in just a moment, they have found an inscription that talks about Pilate. And since then, they found a number of references to Pilate in Roman history. We know, for instance, that Pilate was the prefect or governor of Palestine from 26 to 36 AD. And his main residence was in Caesarea Maritima, which is, Pilate had a cruel, it would be like, this is the armpit of the world to the Romans, okay? So he probably resents being there to begin with. And on one occasion, he decided to do something that he thought would be good for the Jews. He decided they needed a new water system. But he decided to pay for that water system by raiding the temple treasury. Now, how do you think that made the Jews feel? Well, obviously they were upset about that. They were incensed, and so they rioted in the streets, and a mob even went to Pilate's residence to protest. So Pilate had his soldiers dress in plain clothes and go and mix with the crowd, and he came out on the pretense that he was going to make an apology to the Jewish people. But at a signal, those soldiers that were in the crowd pulled their swords out and massacred a number of the people. On many occasions, Pilate was recalled to Rome, where he received a tongue lashing from Caesar himself. He was constantly in trouble. And it's important because at the time of Jesus' trial, Pilate 3, the chief priests bring to Pilate, the only charge that he even considers is that Jesus claims to be the king of the truth. Listens to me. Now, in that exchange that takes place there, Pilate seems to become convinced that Jesus really isn't a threat to the Roman Empire. Even though there is this title, King of the Jews, given to him, Pilate doesn't seem to think that there's really any desire for an insurrection or for a revolt on Jesus' part. And so verse 3 says, the chief priest accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of? But Jesus still made no reply. And Pilate was amazed. It appears, at least, that at this point the chief priests realize that Pilate realizes that Jesus isn't a threat. Their case against him is falling apart. And so they get angry. And they begin throwing out accusations about him. But Pilate is not a fool. If you skip down to verse 10, it tells us very clearly he knows these guys are phonies. He knows what they're up to. And yet he is amazed at Jesus' silence. In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Now, the chief priests are wrong. They make the assumption that Jesus cannot do anything on his own behalf. He could. We just sang a song. He could have called 10,000 angels, right? But here before Pilate, it appears that Jesus could have ended this whole thing. If he could have given some kind of answer that Pilate then could have used, Pilate was ready to let him go. Pilate was ready to dismiss the charges and free him. Obviously, at this point, Pilate's sympathy, and understand, I'm not saying he was very sympathetic because it was all about politics to him, but Pilate's leaning at this point would have been to release Jesus. He is not siding with the chief priests. He knows that they are trying to railroad this man. But he marvels. He marvels because Jesus is not cooperating with him. Jesus, give me something. Give me something that I can take on your behalf so that I can release you. Jesus gives him nothing. And he marvels at that. Which brings us to the second question. Why did the crowds choose Barabbas instead of Jesus? At this point, the other gospel accounts have Jesus being taken before Herod the Great. Herod the Great is viewed by the Romans as this puppet king of the Jews. And so they take him before Herod, but again, Jesus stands before Herod silent. Herod tries to make mockery of him. He teases him. He makes sport of him, but he gets nowhere, and so Herod returns him back to Pilate. And this is where Mark continues the story. He says, now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. All the gospel writers describe Barabbas in the same way. That he was a bloodthirsty revolutionary. He was a Jewish terrorist. He was a murderer. His name, Barabbas, means son of the Father. And catch this. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that his given name was Jesus. Jesus, small s son of the small f Father. And here is this historical coincidence. This is where things start getting crossed up. Okay? The crowd is now confronted with having to make a choice. Do you want Jesus, the small s son of the small f Father, or do you want Jesus, the capital S son of the capital S Father? One of them is a terrorist. He's a revolutionary. He's a murderer. The other comes in peace to serve and to sacrifice. Which one do you want? Now, why did the crowd choose Barabbas? I think it's because they were disappointed with Jesus. No doubt, these people in Jerusalem, Israel's not that big, they would have known somebody who had been touched by Jesus. They would know somebody who was blind but could now see. They would know somebody who was deaf but could now hear. They would know somebody who had been lame but can now walk. They would all have some kind, the 7 degrees of separation thing, you've heard about that? Well, I bet they wouldn't have to go 2 or 3 degrees of separation away to know of somebody that had been personally touched by Jesus. He had awakened a hope within the people. Messiah, this one that's going to come and free us from Roman rule. But now they see him. He's standing there, helpless before this Roman governor. And apparently he is unwilling or he is unable to do anything about it. And so their loyalty collapsed. And they abandoned him. In anger and in disappointment, they choose Barabbas. But you know what? We too occasionally face the same kind of decision that the Jews did with Jesus and Barabbas. Have you ever been disappointed with Jesus? Maybe you expected Jesus to act in a certain way on your behalf and he didn't. I have. Been there, done that. I was sure I knew what Jesus was going to do. And he disappointed me. And when we reach that point, and there's a good chance at some point in your life you will, We've got to make a choice. Will I continue to follow Jesus, or am I going to follow something else? And many people at these crucial moments in their lives choose to follow something else. But continually in my mind, I have repeated the verse of Peter in John chapter 6 and verse 68 when he said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And I will continue to choose this way for the rest of my life. Third question. Why did Pilate scourge Jesus? Ron mentioned in his comments a while ago that we talk a lot about the suffering of Jesus. Interesting, though, the Gospels really don't. They skip right over it. The Gospels talk more about the emotional suffering of Jesus than the physical, but we talk more about the physical than we do the emotional. Why did Pilate scourge Jesus? Well, he knew that the crowd wanted him to release Barabbas. And so in verse 12, he says, what shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Now, I think Pilate was stunned by this reaction. But he is on the political hot seat. He needs some points with the Jews. He also needs to make some points with the Romans. And so verse 15 says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. From other accounts, this is more of a clear two-step process. Mark doesn't really show it that way. Mark kind of makes it just going from scourging to crucifixion. But it's more of a two-step process in the other Gospels. And here's what I mean by that. Pilate had Jesus scourged, brutally beaten. If you've seen the Passion of Christ, you've seen what scourging was like. It's a whip that has on the ends of each whip bone and metal, and the whole intention of this is to flay open a human being's back, to just tear their back into ribbons of flesh. This was not typical for a Roman execution. This is not what happened, because really the Romans wanted a person to hang on the cross for a long time. They wanted people to see the suffering so they could say, that's what happens to you if you mess with us. So they didn't usually scourge people before they were crucified. I think it's Pilate's last attempt to spare Jesus' life. Let me just give him a good beating, and then I'll show him to the people, and they'll say, oh, that's good enough. And so that's exactly what he does. He has him scourged. John says in John 19 and verse 3, he brings him back out before the people and says, behold the man. He's wanting them to pity Jesus at this point. But his plan didn't work. And stirred up by the chief priest in the crowd shouts even louder, crucify him. Which brings us to our final question. Why did the soldiers treat Jesus with such hatred and cruelty? In verse 16, it says the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, the sign of royalty. Then they twisted together a crown of thorns and they set it on him. And they began to call out to him, Hail, King of the Jews! Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid mock homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Again, this was not normal procedure in an execution by crucifixion. These were rough, hardened soldiers who had regularly to carry out gruesome orders. And they could callously take a man and nail him to a cross and then go eat breakfast. But this is an event that has a lot of passion in it. They are already emotionally upset at the Jews. Hey, there's Jewish terrorists that have killed some of their comrades. Barabbas may have even been one of them. They have this hatred for the Jews. And so they indulge in this cruel and insulting mockery. They make this crown of thorns and they put it on his head. And they take a reed and that becomes his scepter. And they put a purple robe on him. And then they mockingly bow down before him. And they spit on him and they hit him in the head with the reed. Why are they doing this? Why all of this insulting mockery? I think the answer is revealed in what they actually said. Hail, King of the Jews. It's dripping with sarcasm. They're angry at the Jews. And all of their pent-up hatred and resentment against this stubborn, difficult people comes pouring out on this one that in their mind claims to be their king. All their bigotry, all of their racial hatred toward the Jews is poured out on Jesus. Which isn't that much different than what happens just a few hours later on the cross. When all the guilt of our wickedness and all our sin was laid upon him. And so I want us to consider this idea of Jesus taking punishment that others deserve. Barabbas. Everything we know about this man was evil. By all rights, he was deserving of crucifixion. And yet, the capital S Son of the capital F Father took the cross that belonged to the small s Son of the small f Father. Jesus died, and as a result, Barabbas lived. And that's really the whole gospel message, isn't it? Like Barabbas, we've all messed up. Oh, I'm not as bad as he is. Doesn't matter. We've all messed up, and we've all messed up big time. Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23 says that the wages of sin is death. We are all deserving of death. But here's where things get crossed up. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. That is good news. And that is so crossed up, isn't it? And so there's this beautiful legend that's told about Barabbas. We can't say with complete certainty that it happened, but it's one of those things I sure hope did. Are you with me? And so the legend goes like this. After Barabbas was released by Pilate, he went back to the very life he had been living before. Robbing, killing. And later on he was taken captive again, but this time he was placed on a prison island by the Romans. And on this prison island, they had to wear an earring that had on it the image of Caesar. It was a way of saying, you belong to me now. You're my property. Well, by this time, Christianity was beginning to spread across the Roman Empire, and because of persecutions, there were some Christians that were also on this prison island. And as Barabbas worked side by side with them, he began to learn a little bit about who Jesus was. And then he realized that that was the man who had literally taken his cross that he deserved, had died for him. And the message shook him so much that he gave his life to Jesus. And that he took that earring and he scraped off the image of Caesar and he put in its place a cross. Is that story true? I want it to be true. I think it's a beautiful story. Did Barabbas come to know that Jesus had died for him? I hope so. But more important for us today, do you know that Jesus took the cross that you deserve? Do you know that? Do you know that he took your deserved punishment? Do you know that? Do you know that the death you deserve because of sin, he has now transformed into eternal life? Do you know that? Because while we can't know exactly what happened to Barabbas, we can know what Jesus means to us. And I don't think we can really be a Christian if we do not understand that transaction. Today, we want to make it possible for you, if you don't know Jesus, that you can come today, be baptized into Christ, be joined with him there. We certainly always offer an opportunity for you to come and request prayer or go to room 102 to meet with an elder and his wife. You have these opportunities, and we offer them to you, hoping that you will respond as we stand together and as we sing.